Tonight's story is here to help you slow down, relax, and gently drift toward sleep. There's nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to go. Simply get comfortable, take a slow breath, and allow the story to unfold at its own quiet pace. In a moment, we'll step into a quiet place far from the noise of the day, somewhere calm and softly lit, where the world moves a little slower and the night feels peaceful. And if you happen to fall asleep during the story, that's perfectly all right. Just close your eyes, relax, and let the journey begin. Behind an old row of stone houses, beyond a narrow gate that most people passed without noticing, there lay a garden enclosed by high walls, weathered smooth by rain and time. By day it was lovely in a simple, well-tended way, filled with herbs, roses, climbing ivy, and neat paths of pale stone. But it was at night that the place seemed to belong fully to itself. When the last voices faded from the nearby streets and the final kitchen window went dark, the garden would settle into a deeper kind of quiet. The air would cool, the scents would change. Damp earth would rise more clearly from the beds. Lavender and thyme would seem softer but fuller. The pale blossoms near the back wall would catch what little moonlight there was and glow faintly, as if they had borrowed something from the stars above. And in the little house attached to the far edge of the garden, where a single lamp still burned behind lace curtains, the gardener would begin to wake. The gardener did not wake quickly. There was no need for that. The world beyond the walls was resting, and this place asked for no urgency. In the small room above the garden shed, where a narrow bed stood beneath a slanted ceiling, and shelves held folded cloths, packets of seeds, and little labeled jars, the gardener opened their eyes slowly and lay still for a moment, listening. The old house had its own small sounds at night. Wood settling, a faint hum of wind near the eaves, the quiet ticking of a clock downstairs. Beyond that, there was the soft hush of leaves moving lightly outside. Nothing sharp, nothing sudden. Only the familiar murmuring of a place content to be itself. The gardener pushed back the blanket, sat up, and drew a robe around their shoulders. The floorboards were cool beneath bare feet. A small basin of water stood ready on the washstand. The gardener washed their face, tied back their hair, and dressed in simple dark clothes that would not catch too easily on vines or brambles. Then, carrying a small brass key, they moved downstairs, where the glow of a single oil lamp warmed the kitchen walls in gold. The kitchen was small but orderly, as though every object had long since found the place where it most belonged. A wooden table stood near the window. A kettle rested on the stove. Bundles of herbs hung upside down from a beam overhead, drying slowly in the dim warmth left from the evening fire. The gardener lit the stove again with practiced hands, fed it 2 small pieces of wood, and set the kettle on to warm. While it heated, they opened the back door just enough to let the night air in. It slipped into the room cool and fragrant, carrying the scent of soil, leaves, and distant rain that had passed earlier over the town. The garden beyond was shadowed and still, though not empty. Even from the threshold, the gardener could feel its quiet waiting. A pair of gloves lay folded on the table. A lantern rested beside them, cleaned and filled the evening before. On a shelf by the door stood a little row of tools polished by frequent use: pruning shears, a hand trowel, twine, a narrow watering can for delicate seedlings. The kettle began to murmur softly. The gardener poured hot water over a little pinch of mint and chamomile, cupped both hands around the steaming mug, and stood in the doorway for a while, looking out over the paths and beds as if greeting an old friend who did not require words. The first task was always the lanterns. The garden had several of them, small and low, set at intervals along the paths and near the arches where climbing plants grew thickest. They were not bright lanterns, and they were not meant to be. Their light did not erase the dark so much as soften it, creating little islands of warmth where stone met earth, where leaves caught a faint shine, where a rose or fern or trailing tendril appeared for a moment and then receded again into night. Carrying the unlit lantern in one hand and their tea in the other, the gardeners stepped out into the garden and closed the door gently behind them. The path beneath their shoes was pale and slightly damp. A fine sheen of earlier rain still clung to the edges of leaves. Somewhere near the center of the garden, water moved quietly in a small basin, fed by a narrow spout shaped like a fish. The gardener paused at the first post, hung the lantern, and lit it with a taper. A warm flame bloomed behind the glass. Then they moved to the next, and each time another small circle of light opened in the darkness, revealing stone, soil, stems, and petals with gentle clarity. The garden did not seem disturbed by this. Rather, it seemed to wake into itself more fully, as though the lanterns were not intrusions, but invitations. When all the lanterns were lit, the gardener stood still near the center path and looked around. The garden lay in layers before them. Closest was the herb bed, tidy and low, its rosemary, sage, and thyme silvered faintly by the light. Beyond that grew a broader section of flowering plants, arranged not in rigid rows, but in patient drifts, each one returning season after season to the place where it had been happiest before. Near the west wall rose the old climbing roses, their canes trained along a trellis of dark wood. To the east stood several fruit trees, small and carefully kept, their branches shaped over years into graceful forms that made both pruning and harvest easier. Farther back, there was a section for night-blooming plants, pale flowers that opened only after sunset and filled the air with a subtle sweetness that seemed strongest when no one tried too hard to notice it. Ivy climbed the walls. Moss softened the corners. A stone bench sat beneath an arch heavy with leaves. The basin near the center reflected one wavering lantern flame and then another. Everything was quiet. Everything was present. The gardener took a slow breath and began to walk. There were always small things to do first, the kinds of tasks that might seem minor to someone hurrying through the day, but which, in the stillness of night, became complete and satisfying in themselves. A leaf had fallen into the basin and was lifted out with 2 fingers. A length of vine had slipped from its tie and was fastened back against the trellis with a piece of soft twine. A pot by the wall had turned slightly from the wind and was set straight again. The gardener moved from one tiny correction to another, never fast, never aimless, and each thing they touched seemed to settle more neatly into place. At the herb bed, they ran their fingers lightly over rosemary tips and checked the soil with the back of one gloved hand. Near the roses, They examined a cane where the bark looked rougher than the rest and trimmed away a dry offshoot no longer useful to the plant. Under the fig tree, they bent to clear a few soggy petals from the base where rain had knocked them loose. None of it was difficult. None of it needed force. It was simply care given in small, steady gestures, one after the next, until the rhythm of it became as natural as breathing. Beyond the herb beds, there was a narrower path, less often seen from the house, that curved behind a high grouping of shrubs into what felt almost like another garden hidden inside the first. The gardener liked this part best in the deepest hours of night. The walls here were clothed in ivy so thick that they seemed softer than stone. White flowers climbed a lattice and opened like small pale stars. Ferns gathered beneath them. The ground held coolness longer, and the scents drifted more slowly. The gardener lifted the lantern from its hook and brought it along, letting the light pass gently over the leaves. Here and there, droplets caught and flashed on the edges of stems. A small spider web stretched between two supports near the path, threaded with moisture so fine it nearly vanished unless seen from exactly the right angle. The gardener ducked around it rather than disturb it. On a low table beneath the wall sat several clay pots filled with seedlings still too small to be planted out. Their leaves were tender and bright even in the dim glow, and the gardener leaned close to inspect them one by one, turning one pot a little so its growth would remain even, touching the soil in another to judge whether it would want water before dawn. The air in this corner of the garden felt quieter than the rest, though the whole place was quiet already. It was the sort of hush that made every movement seem naturally slower, every breath fuller. After a time, the gardener came to the old glass house at the far end of the path. It was not large, only a narrow structure with fogged panes and a roof pitched steeply enough to shed rain quickly. But in the night, it held its own distinct atmosphere, half sheltered and half open to the world. Moisture always gathered along the inside of the glass. Pots lined the shelves in tidy rows. Vines climbed thin strings from bench to rafter. Inside were the plants that wanted more protection or more warmth than the outer beds could offer. Tender cuttings, certain herbs, a lemon tree in a wide pot, a tray of seedlings that would one day be moved to the kitchen garden in the lower yard beyond the wall. The gardener opened the latch and stepped in. At once the air changed. It was warmer here, but not heavily so, and rich with the layered scent of leaves, damp terracotta, and growing things. Drops ticked softly from condensation somewhere near the back shelf. The gardener set down the lantern, then moved slowly through the narrow aisle, touching one pot and then another, pinching away a spent bloom, turning a tray half an inch, lifting a leaf to check its underside for the smallest sign of trouble. Nothing was ever rushed in the glass house. It rewarded calm attention. The gardener seemed to know that, and gave it exactly what it asked. There was an old wooden stool near the door, and for a while the gardener sat there, cradling what remained of the tea, and looking out through the hazed panes into the garden beyond. The lanterns outside glowed softly along the path, their light blurred by the glass. Leaves moved gently whenever the breeze passed. The basin near the center reflected one pale point of brightness and held it wavering on the surface. Far beyond the wall, the town was silent. The gardener did not appear sleepy. Rather, they seemed most awake in these hours, when nothing loud pressed upon the senses, and each small thing could be noticed as fully as it deserved. A leaf shape, a tiny new tendril curling where yesterday there had been none. The way a flower held its petals differently at night than by day. The way damp soil darkened to nearly black beneath lamplight. These were not large events, but in the garden they were enough. They made the night feel full. When the tea was finished, the gardener returned the cup to the little shelf by the glass house door and took up the narrow watering can. This was not the hour for soaking the beds. That had been done earlier, while the warmth of evening still lingered. Now the watering was selective, quiet, and careful, meant only for those things that needed a little extra moisture before morning. In the glass house, there were 3 such trays. Outside, a shallow planter beneath the south wall had dried faster than the rest under the shelter of the eaves. The gardener filled the can from the rain barrel, lifted it with both hands, and poured in a thin, steady stream so delicate that the soil took the water without sound. At the seedling trays, they watered from high enough to spread the fall and low enough not to bend the stems. At the planter under the wall, they gave only what was needed, then set the can down and watched for a moment as the darkened soil settled around the roots. Every motion was patient. There was no spilling, no splashing, no wasted effort. The water seemed not merely applied, but offered. In the hush of the garden, even this simple task became soothing, measured, almost ceremonial. As the night deepened, the sky above the open center of the garden cleared a little more. A few stars showed where before there had been only a gray drift of cloud. The gardener noticed this only in passing. Their attention remained mostly near at hand, in the things before them. They trimmed a basil plant that had gone leggy in one corner of the glass house. They gathered a few fallen leaves from beneath the bench. They checked the string supports along the tomato vines and tightened one knot so gently that the vine barely stirred. Then they stepped outside again, closed the latch, and carried the lantern toward the orchard corner where the fruit trees stood in patient rows. The night-blooming flowers near the back wall had opened more fully now. Their white petals glowed almost silver. Their scent drifted lightly, blending with the cooler smell of leaves and damp bark. The gardener moved past them as though moving through a memory, familiar with every turn and stone, every bend of path, every place where roots lifted slightly beneath the soil. Nothing surprised them here, and yet nothing seemed dull through familiarity. The garden was known, yes, but also endlessly changing in the small ways living things change from day to day, hour to hour, season to season. Under the pear tree, the gardener paused and looked upward through the leaves. The lantern made the lower branches warm and gold, while above them the rest faded into layered shadow. A single pear, left late on the branch by oversight or intention, hung near the center like a small moon. The gardener smiled at that, though only a little, and reached up to touch the nearest leaf where a droplet still clung. It fell soundlessly. Nearby, at the edge of the path, a low border of chamomile had spread farther than expected, and the gardener crouched to lift one spill of stems away from the stone so no one would step on it in the morning. The action was small. It took almost no time, but afterward the border looked as though it had always meant to grow that way, soft and full, but just clear of the path. The gardener stood again, drew in the scent of the crushed leaves that had released under their hand, and moved on. At the very back of the garden, where the wall was oldest and darkest with moss, there was a narrow wooden gate that opened into a lower yard, used more for practical growing than beauty. Beans climbed their supports there. Potatoes were mounded in neat rows. Cabbages sat broad and heavy in the earth. This part of the garden was less ornamental, and perhaps less hidden in the imagination, yet at night it held its own plain loveliness. The gardener opened the gate and stepped through. Here the earth smelled deeper, richer, more open. The rows stretched out in quiet order. A half moon of tools hung beneath the shed awning. The gardener lifted a hoe, not to dig, but to draw lightly through the path between the rows, where small weeds had pushed up after the rain. The blade moved in short, shallow strokes. Soil shifted softly. Now and then the gardener bent to gather what had been loosened and carried it aside to the compost heap near the fence. Again, there was no hurry. The work was simply the work, and in being done calmly, it gave back a calm of its own. Near the compost heap, steam rose faintly into the cool night air. The gardener stood beside it for a moment, lantern low in one hand, watching that pale breath drift upward and vanish. The heap had been turned 2 days before and still held warmth at its center. In the morning, it would be fed with the spent leaves and clippings gathered tonight. But for now, the gardener only checked the cover, straightened one board near the edge, and returned to the rows. A moth moved past the lantern and disappeared into shadow. Far beyond the wall, perhaps from another garden or a lane near the town edge, came the soft bark of a dog, once and then no more. The gardener paused to listen, then resumed the shallow cultivation between rows. The stars widened overhead. The lantern flame remained steady. The garden, practical and ornamental alike, continued to breathe in long, slow breaths, and the gardener moved within it as though they had always belonged to its night side, just as much as the flowers, the trees, the damp soil, and the drifting scents of leaf and bloom. This was the first deep part of the night's work, when everything settled into rhythm and no task felt separate from the next. Light one lantern, lift one fallen leaf, water one tray of seedlings, tie one rose cane, check one latch, touch one leaf, listen one moment, walk one path, then another again. The gardener never seemed to tire of this repetition. Instead, they seemed carried by it, soothed by it, as though the garden asked for the same kind of patience that sleep itself asks for. Not effort, but willingness, not speed, but gentle continuation. And so the night moved on, not toward an ending, but deeper into itself, while the gardener crossed and recrossed the pale stone paths, leaving behind no sound harsher than a footstep softened by damp earth, no brightness stronger than the little lantern's glow, and no feeling more urgent than the quiet wish that every growing thing under their care should meet the morning well. After the lower yard had been tended for a while, the gardener rested the hoe against the shed wall and stood quietly in the dim lantern glow, looking over the rows as if there were no need to think beyond the next small thing. And perhaps there was not. The bean leaves, still touched with the dampness of earlier rain, lifted and settled softly whenever the breeze found them. The broad cabbage leaves held shadows in their folds, so deep they seemed almost blue-black. The narrow earth paths between the beds had darkened where the soil still kept the night's moisture close to the surface, and in that dark earth there was a richness of scent that rose more clearly now than it ever did by day. The gardener drew in a slow breath and felt that familiar sense of quiet belonging that had brought them out here night after night for so many years that the work no longer felt separate from rest. There was effort in it, yes, but not strain. There was attention, but not worry. The tasks of the night did not crowd one another. They came one at a time, each simple, each complete in itself, and together they made a rhythm gentle enough to settle the mind instead of filling it. The gardener moved along the rows once more, using gloved fingers now instead of tools, checking the ties on the bean poles, lifting a leaf to see whether rain had pooled too long in its curve, brushing a small drift of debris away from the base of a stem, straightening a marker that had leaned slightly in the soft ground. Nothing here required haste. The night was wide and patient. It held enough time for every careful motion. At the far corner of the lower yard, there stood a narrow bench beneath the overhang of a lean-to roof, and on that bench were several shallow trays of cuttings taken earlier in the week from herbs and climbing plants that rooted best when given shelter. The gardener lifted the lantern and carried it there, its light sliding over the wood grain of the bench and the rims of the trays, revealing neat rows of stems pressed into dark soil. Some were rosemary, some were lavender, some were slips from a vine trained along the inner wall near the old archway. The gardener crouched and examined them one by one, not expecting sudden growth, not searching for a miracle, but simply noticing what was present. Here a cutting had stayed firm and green. There another leaf had yellowed and needed pinching away. In one tray, the soil had drawn back slightly from the edge and wanted the smallest addition of water. The gardener set down the lantern, fetched the narrow can again, and moistened the trays with that same careful hand, adding only enough to darken the surface, and then stopping before the water could stand. The cuttings seemed even quieter than the larger plants, if that were possible, as though all their strength was turned inward toward the invisible work of taking hold beneath the soil. The gardener lingered with them for a while, resting one hand on the bench, watching the way droplets gathered on the edges of leaves and then vanished into shadow. And there was something peaceful in that too. The knowledge that much of growth happened where no one could see it, and yet remained no less real for being hidden. When the cuttings had been checked and the lower yard no longer asked for anything immediate, the gardener lifted the lantern once again and returned through the narrow wooden gate into the main enclosed garden. The change was subtle but distinct. The ornamental paths, with their pale stones and drifting scents, felt softer than the neat, practical rows behind the wall. Here the lantern light seemed warmer against the leaves. Here the curves of beds and arches made the garden feel less like a set of tasks and more like a conversation carried on slowly over many seasons. The basin near the center gave back a wavering reflection of the lantern as the gardener passed, and the fish-shaped spout whispered a tiny thread of water into the bowl below, a sound so delicate that one had to be very still to hear it fully. The gardener paused there and set the lantern on the basin edge for a moment, then leaned to skim 2 more leaves from the surface. not because they were many, but because their removal restored the water's calm mirror. When the leaves were laid aside, the reflected lantern flame stretched long and unbroken in the basin once again. The gardener seemed pleased by that, though the pleasure was quiet, almost private, and after a moment they lifted the lantern and continued toward the long border along the west wall where the roses climbed. The roses looked different at night than they did under the sun. Their colors were hidden, but their forms grew clearer. Petals held the light on their edges. Thorns cast tiny, sharp shadows on the canes. The new growth at the tips had a faint brightness even in the dark, as though the plant itself made a pale outline where life was freshest. The gardener moved along the trellis slowly, one hand holding the lantern out just enough to see, the other touching a cane here and there, following its line, feeling for roughness, weakness, or strain. A spent bloom was clipped away with the quiet bite of the pruning shears. A long, flexible shoot was brought gently toward the trellis and tied with soft twine so it would grow where it could be supported. A leaf marked by some small damage was turned over, considered in the lantern light, then left in place because it was still doing more good than harm. The gardener never seemed eager to cut more than necessary. There was restraint in the work, a respect for the plant's own direction, and when they did trim, it was with the care of someone shaping, not forcing. The shears opened and closed softly. A petal drifted down. The lantern flame shifted a little in the breeze, and then steadied. All the while, the rest of the garden remained quietly awake around them, the herbs silver and low, the fruit trees dark and motionless except for their leaves, the night-blooming flowers holding their pale cups open toward the sky. Beyond the rose wall, the path curved under an arch of ivy and led toward the oldest part of the garden, where stone gave way in places to moss and narrow strips of thyme that had seeded themselves between the cracks. The gardener slowed there, perhaps because the footing wanted more care, or perhaps because this part of the garden always invited a gentler pace. The lantern light fell over the stones and made each uneven edge clear. Small ferns leaned outward from the base of the wall. A pot set on a low pedestal held a trailing plant whose leaves glistened with moisture and hung like a green waterfall in the dimness. The gardener touched one trailing stem, lifting it so it would not drag too heavily against the pedestal, then moved to the bench beneath the arch. On the bench lay a folded cloth left there earlier in the evening, and beneath it rested a small notebook bound in dark blue fabric. The gardener picked it up, opened it, and stood in the lantern glow writing a few lines with a short pencil kept tucked inside the cover. The entries were never long. A note about the roses, a note about the moisture in the cuttings, a note to check the south wall planter again if the wind changed before morning. The writing itself took only a minute or two, but when it was done, the gardener paused with the notebook still open, as if listening not for what to write next, but for whether the garden had anything more to tell them before they closed the page. Then the pencil was tucked away again, the cloth refolded, and the notebook placed back on the bench to be returned later to the house. From there, the gardener crossed to the night-blooming section, carrying the lantern lower now so the light would not glare against the white petals. This part of the garden always seemed the most dreamlike in the deepest hours. The flowers here were pale, some nearly white, some with a wash of cream or the faintest green at the base, and in the lantern glow they appeared almost luminous. Their scent gathered low in the cool air and drifted softly as the gardener moved between them. There were long trumpets of moonflower opening among dark leaves, and clusters of small star-shaped blossoms nodding on thin stems, and low mounds of pale blooms whose fragrance was strongest only after midnight. The gardener did not disturb them more than necessary. They knelt once to lift a bent stem and support it with a thin twig. They pinched away 2 spent blossoms hidden beneath fresher ones. They loosened the soil at the edge of one pot with their fingers so the roots would breathe after the rain. But much of the time in this corner was spent not doing, only noticing. The gardener seemed content to stand and breathe the scented air, to watch the way the flowers shone against the dark, to feel the coolness of the night gathering along the wall. Nothing in that pause was wasted. In the life of the garden, attending quietly was its own kind of care. After the night-blooming beds came the narrow path to the orchard corner, and the gardener followed it with the lantern held close to the ground, revealing first the path stones, then the grass edging them, then the low trunks of the fruit trees beyond. The orchard was small, only 4 trees in all, but each had been shaped with patience over many years and carried a distinct presence of its own. The pear tree stood nearest the path, graceful and open. Beyond it was the plum, denser and more shadowed, with bark rougher to the touch. Along the far wall grew the fig in a protected spot that held warmth longer than the rest of the garden. And nearest the back bench, where morning light came earliest, stood a young apple tree still finding its form. The gardener walked beneath them one at a time, lifting the lantern now and then to inspect a branch junction, or bending to gather a leaf that had dropped too early, or laying a hand lightly against the trunk as if measuring its quiet firmness through the glove. Under the pear tree they paused longest. A few fallen petals from the spring bloom still lingered in the moss around the roots, pale and water softened into something like memory. The gardener crouched there, cleared away a little mat of wet debris from the root flare, and then stayed kneeling for a moment longer, looking not only at the tree, but through it, into the layered dark of leaves and lantern light beyond. The orchard held a stillness within the stillness of the rest of the garden, as though trees, even small ones, kept their own slower time. The fig by the wall needed more practical attention. One branch had put on growth in a direction that would crowd the neighboring path if left unchecked. And though the gardener did not like cutting at night unless necessary, this was an easy correction, and the plant would not mind. The shears came out again. The gardener examined the branch, traced it back to where it might best be shortened, and made one clean cut. The branch lowered gently into their hand. Its leaves smelled green and faintly sweet when bruised. Rather than leave it where it fell, the gardener carried it to the compost cart kept near the shed and laid it on top with care. Then they returned to the fig, looked once more, and seemed satisfied that the shape was now more balanced. This done, they passed to the apple tree and adjusted the strap securing one young limb to a support cane. It had not come loose, only tightened a little as the branch thickened, and the gardener eased it so that growth would remain supported without being pinched. Again, the actio was small, again it left the tree slightly better able to meet the morning. And again the gardener seemed to take from the act not the sharp satisfaction of finishing something large, but the quiet peace of having set one small thing right. By now, the stove in the little house would have cooled enough for another cup to be welcome, but the gardener did not return immediately. Instead, they crossed the center of the garden once more and stepped into the glass house for a second round of checking. Not because something had gone wrong, but because the deep hours of the night often brought subtle changes. Condensation had gathered more thickly along the inside panes. One tray of seedlings near the back shelf had lifted slightly toward the glass where the air was coolest, and the gardener turned it a quarter turn. The lemon tree wanted its pot shifted half an inch so a crowded branch would not rub the pane. A tendril from the climbing vine had found its way around the wrong support string and needed gently winding onto the proper one. The gardener moved through these adjustments with the same calm economy as before. Lantern on the floor now, casting a low, warm light up through the leaves and making the whole narrow house feel like a little chamber of quiet green life, suspended between darkness outside and the day still waiting far away. When all was as it should be, the gardener opened the glass house vent by one notch, allowing a little more of the cool night air to circulate. They stood beneath it, feeling the change against their cheek, and then stepped back out into the garden. Only then did they return to the house for more tea. Inside, the kitchen felt warmer than before, though the fire had not been fed much. The herbs hanging overhead gave off a faint, dry sweetness that mixed with the smell of warm iron from the stove. The gardener set the lantern on the table, spooned more mint and a little lemon balm into the pot, and poured water over them. While the tea steeped, they stood at the sink and washed the pruning shears, drying them carefully so no dampness would dull them by morning. The gloves were shaken free of leaf bits and laid open to air. A handful of twine was rewound neatly around its spool. On the windowsill, a single pot of basil grew within reach of the kitchen, and the gardener brushed the leaves with one fingertip as they waited. Then the tea was poured, pale steam lifting in the lamplight, and the gardener carried the mug back outside to the step, where they sat for a few quiet minutes, looking over the lantern-lit paths. From the step, the garden appeared both familiar and slightly dreamlike, the way known things often do at an hour when the rest of the world has withdrawn. The bench under the arch glowed faintly. The basin held two reflections now, one from the nearest lantern and one from a second farther down the path. The white flowers near the back wall seemed almost suspended in darkness rather than rooted in soil. The fruit trees stood like gentle shadows. The gardener sipped the tea slowly and listened. There was the tiniest ticking from the cooling lantern glass, the light brush of leaves against one another when the breeze passed. Far off, perhaps from the lane beyond the outer wall, the muted roll of cartwheels or some other late movement passing through the sleeping town. None of it broke the quiet. It only deepened it by contrast. The gardener seemed in no hurry to rise again, but after a while they did, because the night still had many hours left, and the garden, though content, always offered another small thing to notice, another path to walk, another corner where care might be given in a form as simple as standing still long enough to see what was already there. When they set the empty mug inside and came out once more, The lantern light appeared slightly lower along the paths, not dimmer, but warmer, as though the darkness around it had settled more deeply and made each little flame more companionable. The gardener took up a small basket and began to gather what the night had already given freely. A few herbs for drying, 2 blossoms that had opened fully and would be better brought indoors before dawn, several fallen fig leaves to dry for scent, a sprig of rosemary brushed by rain, and now fragrant enough to perfume the whole basket. They moved from bed to bed with gentle selectiveness, taking little, leaving much, always mindful that the garden was not there to be emptied or even used so much as accompanied. At the herb border, they clipped only the tips that would encourage fuller growth. At the night flowers, they chose the 2 blossoms that had already begun the tiniest inward curl and would not greet the full morning in perfect shape. By the roses, they picked nothing at all, merely rested a hand on the trellis and moved on. The basket filled slowly. Its contents carried the mingled scents of leaf, bloom, and damp stem, and the gardener, walking among the paths with that little gathered abundance in the crook of one arm, seemed not like an owner moving through possessions, but like a caretaker receiving gifts from a place that trusted their hands. Thus the second deep part of the night unfolded, neither eventful nor empty, but full in the quiet way only gardens seem able to be at such an hour. The practical tasks had not ended. The lantern still required checking, the rose still required observation, the cuttings still wanted shelter and measured water, the ties and stems and supports and leaves all continued in their need for patient attention. Yet woven through those tasks was something else, something softer and harder to name, a companionship between the gardener and the growing things around them. Not a magical thing, not even a mysterious one, only the simple understanding that comes from long care freely given. The garden did not speak, and still it told the gardener much. It told them through the angle of a leaf, the dampness of soil, the scent of bloom at midnight, the way the path stones held or released the memory of warmth. And the gardener answered, not in words, but in water, in twine, in pruning, in stillness, in the little pauses that honored what did not need changing. So the night continued, deepening gently, while the world outside remained asleep, and the hidden garden, lit by its small warm lanterns, kept breathing softly beneath the stars.